15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This video is content for Jessica Allison comparing and contrasting pregnancies with and without HG. So this is my third pregnancy currently, and I have had 2 pregnancies dealing with Hyperemesis Gravidarum. My first pregnancy was 15 years ago with my son, and that pregnancy was pretty textbook, pretty much a cakewalk. It was, I was in my early 20s, and I was able to work throughout my entire pregnancy. I was a waitress at the Olive Garden, and I would work 12-hour shifts and walk 2 miles to work and 2 miles back and just be on my feet, and did totally fine. There was nothing that slowed me down during that pregnancy other than a little bit of normal fatigue in the first and third trimester. I didn't have any kind of sickness during that pregnancy or complications or really any pain. I had some Braxton Hicks at the very end. I remember when I got a little twinge of just feeling a little bit of like morning sickness, and it was kind of more like comparing it to hyperemesis, like, oh, how cute. I didn't even need a saltine cracker. So with that first pregnancy, before I found out I was pregnant, so I was on birth control. I was not expecting to be pregnant. And one morning I was taking my multivitamins with breakfast, just like I always had, and all of a sudden I couldn't keep them down, and so I threw up my vitamins, and I thought, that's weird, I must be getting a bug. And a couple weeks later, we found out that I was pregnant, and I was totally fine. That was like the one of 2 times that I threw up with that pregnancy. The second time was we had gone out to eat spaghetti at a restaurant, and I felt a little bit of sickness, and it came up, and that was it. So there wasn't anything else. I didn't have like continuous morning sickness. There was no nausea, nothing debilitating at all. So there was only those 2 incidences, and that was it. It was such a pleasant pregnancy. And so 12 years later, when we decided to have our daughter, I thought, hey, I can do this, like pregnancies, that's nothing. It's no big deal for me. I got this. And so my husband and I had been together for 9 years, and we got married, and then it was like boom, boom, boom. We got married. A couple months later, we were pregnant with our daughter. We were getting a new house. So there was all this stuff going on. But a week after I found out that I was pregnant with our daughter, I started getting really sick. And I thought, okay, so maybe this is what morning sickness feels like. And I didn't think a whole lot of it right away. I was only maybe like 5 weeks along, so very early. I mean, I had just found out that I was pregnant, so, but it didn't take long. It started kicking in like the first week after I found out that I was pregnant, and then within a couple weeks, it was nonstop. I was throwing up all the time and constantly feeling sick and just nauseous, and I had so many aversions, and I had problems with smells. There was just like everything just sent me through the roof. It was like everything was triggered for me. And I went into tour a birth center because I wanted to work with midwives during that pregnancy, and my goal was to have a natural birth at a birth center. And I must have been maybe like 7 weeks along at that point, and I remember bringing it up to the midwife that I had been throwing up a lot and that I just really felt ill. And I was wondering if this is what normal morning sickness was like. I had never heard of hyperemesis before, so I just assumed it was just part of pregnancy. And she told me to try some Unisom and B6 and see how I do. So we immediately, when we left that tour, went to the store and got Unisom B6, and I took it that night, and I continued to take that for about 16, 18 weeks into that pregnancy. So when I had officially gone into the care of the midwives, it was, I think my first appointment was right around like the 10-week mark. And I was still really sick. And when I brought it up to the midwife, it was a different midwife this time. And she said, it sounds like Hyperemesis Gravidarum. And when I first heard that, I was like, what? Say that again? And she explained a little bit about what it is, that basically, it's just this, a lot of throwing up, and then it goes away. And she had reminded me, keep taking the Unisom B6, and if that's not enough, there's other options like Zofran. You can go to the hospital for fluids, and it just made me nervous. It made me really nervous because I had my mindset on this natural experience, and I had had such a good pregnancy with my son all those years prior, and I didn't want to be in a hospital. I didn't want to be on medications. I was just really scared about the whole thing. And so I went home. I read a little bit about hyperemesis from what I could find, and there was a lot of things on the internet at that time. This is, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and there was just all this information about Zofran causing birth defects, and there was just not really anything that was super helpful for me. Most of what I read just seemed scary. And so I just kind of stuck my head in the sand. I was like, I don't want to read any more about this, which is really unlike me because I like to dig in and research things, especially if it's something that's going on with my body. I want to be able to help myself, and I really like to be able to look for things that are natural and alternative to helping before relying right on, meds for everything. And so that's what I decided to do. I started looking at, what kind of things could I do naturally to help with morning sickness. And that's pretty much what I thought HG was. I didn't do a whole lot of digging in, like I said. So I was trying everything that I could find on the net and asking around. And, of course, everybody wants to ginger and cracker you. But, I tried the whole eat before you wake up and protein and not sugar and not carbs and stay hydrated and lemons, and it was nothing worked. There was just nothing that was working. And during that time, when I would talk about being sick, I had people, like, if I would get online and talk about it, there were people who would just say, you have to pick yourself up and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, welcome to motherhood. And I just knew that it wasn't right, like the amount of sickness that I was dealing with. And so I just continued to take Unisom B6 because anything I had read on it just basically said it had been around a long time, helping with that. So I slept. I pretty much just slept and puked through the first 16 to 18 weeks of that pregnancy. It started to really lighten up around 16 weeks and was completely gone by 18 weeks. I was no longer throwing up, didn't have anything that I had aversions to anymore after that. But I think that because I had been throwing up so much during that time frame, that I have other health issues. I have Hashimoto's and fibromyalgia, and it took a toll on me. I was exhausted the whole rest of that pregnancy, and I had respiratory infections and UTIs and kidney stones, and I just couldn't walk anymore. I was just so depleted, and so it was really brutal for me to get through the rest of that pregnancy. And I think having HG for that period of time probably didn't help because I wasn't obviously getting all the nutrition and fluids that I needed. And so, anyways, after our daughter was born in July of 2016, we both had planned that we wanted to have another kid, but I was really scared. I mean, it was pretty traumatic what I went through with our daughter. And so I was really on the fence about it. I was like, no, I'm not even going to think about this right now. And so time kept passing, and the conversation would come up and we would talk about it, and then I would want to do it. I would want to say, yes, let's try for another kid. But it was just this constant fear of going through what I went through with our daughter. And so I kept putting it off. And then January of this year, 2019, my husband and I were taking a drive and through the mountains, and it was snowy, and we were bringing up the idea of kids again. And we both thought, well, if we don't get pregnant again, then we can look into adoption. And so I started contemplating that, if adoption would be a better route for us to go, because we wanted to grow our family, but I was just way too scared to get pregnant again after being so sick with our daughter. And um, things did not go well at the end of that pregnancy with her. I ended up not being able to have the natural birth that I wanted to at the birth center. Things had just gotten too complicated, and I was switched over to an OB like a week before our daughter was born, and I ended up with my second C-section. So there was just too much on my mind. I was not ready still. And then May came around, and I said, okay, we had talked about this for months now, really like talking about it. And we thought, we're getting older, our daughter's getting older. We want the two kids to be able to be close enough in age to, play and be together. So, because our son is so much older, he's like 12 years older than our daughter. So we knew we wanted these two to be closer. And now she was already, going on 3 years old. And so, we were talking about adoption and looking into it. And I said, okay, here's the thing. How about we just try like one time? And if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. If I get pregnant, then okay, we'll just deal with what comes. And I'm not going to put my head in the sand this time. I'm going to learn everything I can about hyperemesis and, how to help myself and this next baby through it, because it was just so awful the first time around. So, um, that's what we did. We tried in May, and we got pregnant right away. And I was 4 weeks along, and I mean, they're talking like right before, right when I tested, right in that time frame, and I was already getting sick. And so it's like, I already, we took the pregnancy test, but I knew I was pregnant because I was so sick already. And then after being sick for a few days, it started to subside, which made me nervous. And so um, I took another pregnancy test, and it was still positive. And then I started bleeding. And I was bleeding for like a week, and I went into the doctor's office. We tested my hormone levels. Everything was going up, and then it stopped. So, there was this little bit of a scare, and I was told, you might have to consider that you might be miscarrying. And so that whole week was kind of scary, and at that point, the nausea and feeling sick had subsided. And so I thought maybe that's what was happening. And then when we got the news that the hormone levels were going up and then the bleeding stopped, it was like 2 days after that. So we had gotten a call like on a Friday, and that following Monday, it was like, boom, hard hitting, throwing up, and just, it would not stop. And so it went on like that for a couple of weeks, and I was letting my doctor know that I was really sick. I went into the ER. The first time we went into the ER, I had thrown up like 18 times in 2 hours, just a 2 hour period. I had been throwing up that entire day, but in 1 2 hour period, I had thrown up 18 times, and I was just depleted. I was so exhausted, and I told my husband, I said, I can't do this. We're going to have to go into the ER. I need fluid. I need to take care of this and get some meds. And so, and it's scary. I just had to remind myself that I had to make peace that this pregnancy may go the same way as it did with our daughter, and do the best I could for me and baby, and do whatever it took to get through the hyperemesis. And so we went into the hospital, and I started getting fluids, and one of the doctors was kind of like, "You're pregnant, you are nauseous, like, okay, what's the big deal?" And I had to explain like how sick I was, and then they gave me a couple liters of fluid with IV Zofran and Phenergan. Those were the first meds that I tried, and I started to feel better. So I was asking for ice chips and crackers, and we went home, and sure enough, within that 24 hours, I was just puking again, and it just didn't stop, and the aversions were bad. I couldn't handle smells. I couldn't handle sights of food. I couldn't, I didn't want to cook. I didn't want to be around any of it. I was just, everything was overwhelming to my senses. And so it just continued to get worse from there. I went into an OB appointment, and I don't remember how far along I was at that point, but I didn't see my doctor right away. I was already put on Zofran at that point. I had been taking Zofran, and it was not doing a lot. It took a little bit of the edge off for me. And I saw an OB that was a colleague in the same practice as my OB, and she took one look at me and she said, "We need to get you on a PICC line. You are exhausted and dehydrated, and you're not getting enough food down. We need to get you on a PICC line." And so, and at that point, I had already been to the ER multiple times for fluids, and it was so early on in the pregnancy, so I hadn't even really had a chance to still talk with my OB about it, but I said, "Okay, let's do it." And I was nervous to get a PICC line put in. You hear about all the risks and side effects of having a PICC line. There's benefits to it too.
What, Mommy?
Yes, your horsey. Yes. And so
I've been lying.
Yes. Mommy's gonna talk, okay? Okay, silly. So we went in, had the PICC line put in. Shh. We went in, had the PICC line put in, and I had that for about 7 weeks. So at first they put in a peripheral IV, and they put it into my wrist, and I had that for about a week while we waited for my PICC line appointment. And that didn't go so great because my veins kept blowing from the dehydration and the constant throwing up. I wasn't getting any fluids in, and so it was really blessing when I got the PICC line put in, because we didn't have to try to poke around anymore, and I could get 2 liters a day and with some vitamins. And so even though I wasn't able to eat and keep anything down, at least I was getting those 2 liters of vitamins every day, and it was taking the edge off. The fluid with the Zofran was enough to help me kind of, I wouldn't even say coast. I was still throwing up a lot through first and halfway through second trimester. I'm in my 3rd trimester now, and I'm still throwing up. But it was really rough. I mean, we're talking like 40 plus times a day I was throwing up. So at that point, and then my doctor, I went in to go see her. I had the PICC line in for a couple weeks, and she wasn't really thrilled that I had a PICC line in. She's not supportive of the idea of PICC lines during pregnancy, and she didn't like the risks with it or the liability. And she said, "We're going to talk about pulling it." And I didn't know what to say at that point. I just, was like, I don't want to pull it out. It's helping me stay alive at this point. I was just so depleted. And so anyways, a couple more weeks went by, and she said, "Okay, it's time. We're going to pull it out. You need to try harder. We need to stop bypassing your gut. and you need to eat and you need to drink. And if you throw up, you throw up, but you need to keep trying. And if all you get is like 10 ounces of fluid in a day, then that's fine. And I just remember thinking, this is insane because 10 ounces a day is nothing, and I'm pregnant, and I'm going to be so sick again without the PICC line. Like, so sure enough, we pulled the PICC line out, and within 10 days, I had lost like 9 pounds, and I was in the ER, and the ER doctor couldn't believe how ill I was, could not believe that the PICC line was pulled out. He wanted to know why my OB would even think to do that when I was so sick. And I went in for a couple more appointments with my OB at that point, in the following weeks, and she was still not, allowing me to go in and have any fluids or anything. And so I was going to the ER, and then finally she said, okay, we're going to do 2 liters of fluid, once a week. And I asked her, I said, can we do twice? And she said, okay. So I was excited that she was on board to get me fluids again. Still wasn't going to be enough. I knew that, but it was going to be better than nothing than what I was doing without my PICC line. And so what we started with is me going into the urgent care that was there attached to the hospital. And I went there twice a week for 2 liters of fluid. And every time I went in, the nurses were extremely compassionate, very kind nurses. I always had my daughter with me, my 3-year-old with me. But it was a struggle every single time for them to get an IV in my arm to get me started because I was just so dehydrated. My veins were rolling away, they were collapsing, they were blowing. It was just painful, and I was bruising really bad. And we went through a couple, I don't know, like 3 weeks of that. And then they basically said, we can't do this anymore. And I don't know, probably might have been like 4 weeks of that, like a month. And one of the nurses, she just looked like she was ready to just start crying because she said, I just can't do this to you anymore. I feel like it's abuse. And I was getting poked like 12 times a week because it seriously took anywhere from 3 to 6 times to get an IV in every time I went in. And so then they called down the head nurse from the OB practice that was upstairs. And she came down and she took a look at my arms, and they were just bruised, and they weren't being able to get anything going. IVs were not working anymore. Like they couldn't get them in my arm, and if they did, they'd just blow, or the fluid couldn't get in. And so she said, okay, we need to start getting you up to L&D triage. You're 20 weeks along, so let's get you up there. So I started going up to triage, L&D triage, twice a week. And they were struggling to get IVs in, and it always took quite a few attempts before an IV would get going and start working. And so I was covered in bruises. My arms were swollen. They hurt constantly. And I think the most I had been poked with IVs in 1 week was 15 times. And right around, it was a couple of weeks into going up to L&D triage, there was an OB on call. And it was the OB that had ordered my PICC line the first time around, a colleague of my doctor. They're in the same practice together. And she looked at me and she said, this can't continue. She was really upset with what was going on, and the condition of my arms. The nurses were talking to her and saying, what can we do? We're going to have to go through her feet, her legs, her neck, because there's nowhere left to put an IV in her arms or hands. And they really didn't want to go that route. And at that point, my OB was still saying, no, there's no other option. We're not doing anything else for you. You're not getting another PICC line. We're not going to do anything. This is your only option. And so that OB and the head nurse had confronted my OB, and they were urging her to change up her plan of treatment for me, and they were telling her this isn't working for her anymore. There's nowhere left to put IVs in. She's really sick. You really need to reconsider what you're doing. And from what I know, she got upset about it, and then she said, okay, send her to maternal fetal medicine, and if they agree to a PIC line, then she can have it if they take the liability. And so I went into maternal fetal medicine, and the first thing the doctor said is, you don't have hyperemesis. That's good news. And I just looked at him like, what do you mean I don't have hyperemesis? And he says, you just have nausea and vomiting in pregnancy. And I'm like, that's like literally the definition of HG is severe, debilitating nausea and vomiting in pregnancy. And he says, right, but you haven't lost enough weight to be considered having HG. And at that point, I just knew something had happened. So, I figured that my OB had probably called him, and she had not really been on board that I was as ill as I have been, and that I needed fluids, and she was really against me having a PIC line in. And so he sent me away basically with a decision in her hands to give me a midline IV. All the while trying to reassure me with a smile that I was not sick and that I did not have hyperemesis. So I made it up to my car. I put my daughter in her car seat, and I just started sobbing because I had felt so unheard, and I felt like these doctors didn't believe me how ill I was and have been, and that I wasn't going to get help. And I felt really trapped and scared. So I was. It was a Friday, and it was my day to go into the L&D triage for fluids again. And I went in, and the doctor on call there, the OB on call, came in, and she said, are you really sick? Do you need to be here? And do you really feel like you need fluid? And I knew what was going on. Before I even answered her, she says, I looked at your files, and it looks like your doctor and maternal fetal medicine don't think that you're sick and you don't need a PIC line. So do you really feel like you need to be here? And my heart just sunk. And I started crying, and I explained to her that I felt like nobody was listening, that I was not being heard, that some of these doctors were not believing how ill I was, and that I really did need the fluid. And she said, okay, I'll give you a liter tonight. And I said, no, I really need 2. I do so much better when I have 2 liters. So she ended up giving me 2 liters. And then the weekend came, and a whole other mess of things happened, and I ended up being placed with the other OB that was a colleague of my previous OB in that practice. And as soon as I was switched over into her care, she put me right back onto a PIC line. And so I have a PIC line in again. It's been in now since November 11th, so I don't know, a few weeks now. It's the 1st of December, so, and I'm doing better. I am still throwing up, but not nearly as much, only a few times a day. I do 1 liter every single day of fluid with some vitamins in it, which is good because fluids are the hardest thing for me to get down right now. It's really difficult for me to hold any fluid, and if I eat anything, even if it's been hours, and I go and drink anything, it's going to come right up. So being able to still get hydration through my PIC line has been really beneficial for me, and I'm still on Zofran. So those are the differences between my pregnancies. I had one normal, totally textbook, like healthy pregnancy, no complications, was able to work the whole time, and just was a breeze, really, compared to these last 2 pregnancies where I've had HG. The second pregnancy, the HG was pretty bad, but it went away around 16 to 18 weeks. And now with my third pregnancy and my second time with HG, I'm in third trimester. I'm just about 29 weeks along, and it's still going with no end in sight. So it's definitely gotten worse for me the second time around having it. And it's really hard to have this illness. It's like a dark cloud over pregnancy, a time when you want to feel joyful and excited and filled with all this love and these dreams of having your child, and you're just overwhelmed and exhausted, and everything just feels there's so many times during this pregnancy and during my last where it just felt hopeless, and I felt, as soon as I started feeling sick with this third pregnancy, I just felt so stupid for getting pregnant again. And there's a lot of dark nights of the soul with hyperemesis. There were times when it just, the throwing up and being sick, it just doesn't stop. And you think, why did I do this? Maybe we should abort. Maybe we shouldn't have done this. And it's so hard to think those things when you plan to get pregnant, when you want your child, and you feel this immense guilt for thinking those things when you were prepared to have another baby. And there's just no energy for anything or anyone else. You need help with everything. And, I have 2 other kids and my husband, and I've spent so many days just being on the couch and watching cartoons with my 3-year-old and just trying to survive, just trying to feel like just stay alive another day, because it just beats you down, like, in every way. I mean, hyperemesis takes a toll on you mentally, spiritually, physically, financially. It takes a toll on your family. They see what you're going through, and everybody has to pitch in way more and help out. And sometimes you feel crazy because sometimes you think you can eat something and then it's in front of you and you can't eat it, or it's something that has to be so specific and then you can't hold it down. And um, with my 2 kids already, my son now has seen me go through 2 pregnancies with hyperemesis. The first time around, he was 12, and he was scared that I was not going to live through that pregnancy. And he brought it up quite a few times, and we had to talk about it. And then this time around, the second pregnancy, he's now 15, and he has the same concerns. I mean, he's been concerned about, if I'm going to live through it, and then I have the PICC line in and the risks associated with the PICC line, and we've had some scares with it that turned out to not be anything significant, which is good. But there were some symptoms and problems I was having that we thought maybe there might be a clot or infection. And I remember he came home from school, this was just last week, and he looked so upset, and I asked him what was wrong, and he said, I was just so worried about you all day because I didn't know if something was wrong with your PICC line and how you're going to get through the rest of this pregnancy, and I'm so scared sometimes that you're just going to die. And it's really hard to have those conversations and face those fears and concerns from your child. And my 3-year-old has been so compassionate and nurturing throughout this pregnancy. She totally blows my mind. Um, since the first time I started throwing up, she was right on my heels, running into the bathroom behind me, rubbing my back, pulling my hair back, telling me, Ote, mama, Ote, and singing songs to me and trying to make me better. And she has a speech delay, and she would go out and tell my husband, and say, try to tell him that mom's sick, and she would mimic me throwing up. And um, there's been no way to really protect her from seeing me in this condition, seeing me be so sick. It That's really hard because she's so little, and this illness is so overwhelming. And for her to try to make sense of what's wrong with mom and why mom has gone from being able to play all the time and be active with her, and to just crying and puking and sleeping and not being able to cook and not wanting to play and not being able to move around a whole lot. And she's just there bringing me blankets or her stuffed animals, or she wants to read me a story. And she'll come over and tuck me in when I'm really not feeling good and I'm getting into bed or laying on the couch. And she's been through every single time I've had IVs, whether at home or in the hospital, through my PICC lines and dressing changes for my PICC lines. And she's right there holding my hand, and she tells me, deep breaths, mama, deep breaths. It's just hard to see such a little tiny person, and as her mom, I just want to protect her and not have her see, that bringing a baby into this world is like this and so hard. So that's the differences for me between these 3 pregnancies.